Testing 1, 2.
Good evening. I'm Eve Vogelstein, President of Great Talk. I want to thank you for joining us for this live and virtual conversation with the very best minds. Great Talk was founded by our Executive Director, Claudine Davison, and Diane Davison as our Vice President. I joined as President and with our outstanding board, with numbers of Maryland institutions as our venues and partners, along with lots of Great Talk friends. The goodwill of so many enables all of us to enjoy these thought-provoking and educational programs. Tonight, I would like to thank our Great Talk Gold sponsors, the Zaf McKinney Group at Morgan Stanley and LifeBridge Health for their financial support. We are most grateful to the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute at Johns Hopkins University for being our lifelong and valued VIP partner. Thank you to our media co-sponsors, the Baltimore Fishbowl, Baltimore Sun, and JMOR for their support. We are deeply grateful to our fellow board member, William Eggington, Director of the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute, for his major role, his much appreciated support for offering Johns Hopkins University to be a wonderful venue for this evening's event and for facilitating our free parking. Thank you. And a special, yes, that's really very. And a special thank you to Shira Dingle, the Grass Institute Senior Coordinator. We really love that we can offer this event for free. And to those of you who donated when registering for the event, we thank you greatly, as this helps to offset the cost of this free event. And if you still would like to donate, it's never too late. We have QR codes up on the table in the back. We appreciate anything, and you could also visit us at greattalk.org. Great Talk, every dollar counts. Great Talk is an all-volunteer, nonprofit organization which depends on your tax-deductible donations to continue to make these programs available for free, like tonight's special program. A recording of this event is going to be on YouTube, and updates for future events that we have is going to be held on our website, greattalk.org. Well, tonight's provocative topic discussion is one I'm really excited about. And it's actually very timely because there's a show actually coming out on Apple TV on this very topic. I think it's coming this week, so should be fascinating with Billy Crystal. We will have a question and answer following our talk. I want to thank you for being here, all of you, and I would now like to introduce William Eggington, who's going to introduce tonight's panel and our program tonight. Thank you.
Claudine, Diane, let me reiterate these thank you to Shira Dingle, our administrative manager at the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute, who works wonders and is a genius of organization all around. We also have a student helper today, Akash, who's been showing people in, and it's terrific to have him along as well. Special thanks to the panelists, who I'm now going to introduce from your right to the left, and then after I'm finished introducing them, I'm going to hand the mic over to Fred, who I'll introduce last, who's going to moderate the discussion. So, starting from your right, Dr. Matthew W. Johnson, Senior Investigator at the Sheppard Pratt Center for Excellence in Psilocybin Research and Treatment, is an experimental psychologist conducting human research on psychedelics and behavior change. From 2004 to 2024, he conducted seminal psychedelic research at Johns Hopkins, playing a role in the modern-day revival of psychedelic research. In March 2024, he joined Sheppard Pratt to expand his psychedelic research. He has published research on psychedelics in relation to mystical experience, personality change, tobacco smoking cessation, cancer distress treatment, depression treatment, and psychedelic risks and safety guidelines. In 2021, he received, as principal investigator, the first grant in about 50 years from the U.S. government to administer a classic psychedelic as a treatment, specifically psilocybin for tobacco addiction. He is also known for his expertise in behavioral economics, addiction, sexual risk behavior, and research with a wide variety of drug classes. Good. Next, James Matlock, who, that's right, received a BA in English from Emory University in 1977 and a PhD in anthropology from the University of Southern Illinois at Carbondale in 2002. He worked at the American Society for Psychical Research in New York City and at the Rhine Research Center in Durham, North Carolina. Matlock is presently a research fellow. Get up here? Okay, I'm gonna hold it closer. Thank you. How's that? Yeah, I can hear that too. All right. Matlock is presently a research fellow at the Parapsychology Foundation. His chief research interests are the history of parapsychology, anthropology of religion, and reincarnation. He teaches a 15-week online seminar course on reincarnation research and theory. Matlock's book, Signs of Reincarnation, Exploring Beliefs, Cases, and Theory, published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2019, provides the first comprehensive look at the belief in reincarnation and the evidence for the past lives from historical records, anthropological studies, and contemporary research. Next, Tom SHRODER is the author of Old Souls, Scientific Evidence for Reincarnation from Children Who Remember Past Lives, 1999. Acid Test, How a Daring Group of Psychonauts Rediscovered the Power of LSD, MDMA, and Other Psychedelic Drugs to Heal Addiction, Depression, Anxiety, and Trauma, from 2014. The Most Famous Writer Who Ever Lived, A True Story of My Family, 2016. And co-author of Fire on the Horizon, The Untold Story of Gulf Oil Disaster, 2011. His ghostwritten books include The Operator, Firing the Shots That Killed Osama bin Laden, and My Years as a SEAL Team Warrior by Robert O'Neill, which spent 7 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, and Exposure, Poisoned Water, Corporate Greed, and One Lawyer's 20-Year Battle Against DuPont by Robert Bilott, the true story behind the movie Dark Water starring Mark Ruffalo. Yeah, I've seen it too. Very good. At Tropic Magazine in 1988, he edited the work by Dave Barry that won the Pulitzer Prize for Distinguished Commentary, and as editor of the Washington Post magazine between 2001 and 2009, he oversaw staff writer Gene Weingarten's 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning feature stories, Fiddler in the Subway, 2008, and Fatal Distraction, 2010. Finally, our moderator, Fred KAUFMAN. He's a professor of English and journalism at the City University of New York. A contributing editor at Harper's Magazine, his nonfiction has appeared in the New York Times Sunday Magazine, The New Yorker, Harper's, Foreign Policy, Fortune, the Los Angeles Times, The Guardian, Latham's Quarterly, Literary Hub, Scientific American, Salon, Slate, Nature, Wired, Vice, British Medical Journal, and numerous other publications. He's the author of 4 books. Most recently, The Money Plot, A History from Shells to Bullion to Bitcoin. Other books include Bet the Farm, How Food Stopped Being Food, and the award-winning short History of the American Stomach, A Short History of the American Stomach. He hosted and executive produced a Webby-nominated documentary film for Vice Reports and has appeared on MSNBC, Bloomberg TV, Fox Business News, Democracy Now!, C-SPAN, National Public Radio's Radiolab, On the Media, and the BBC World Service, among numerous other broadcasts and podcasts. He has lectured throughout the United States and abroad, including addresses to the National Press Club, PEN, and the General Assembly of the United Nations. And so, without further ado, I'm going to pass Fred the microphone, and he's going to get started moderating this terrific discussion.
Oh, my Lord. Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Yeah, we have a really extraordinary panel, and I want to thank great talks. And I just want to have a moment. I want to thank Claudine Davison in particular. When she called me and asked me if I would do this, what I did not tell her was that my great uncle Jacob Fould invented the Ouija board. So how could I say no to this opportunity?
Are you getting royalties on that?
I wish. So yeah. So I think we'll just get right to this. And what I'd like to do immediately is just kind of go around the horn. Maybe Tom to Jim to Matt. And how did you get into this? What brought you to your interest in this area?
Well, as the editor of Tropic Magazine in Miami, I became aware of this very well-known and well-respected psychiatrist at Mount Sinai Hospital there, who had written a best-selling book called Many Lives, Many Masters, and it was about his experience with hypnotically regressing patients back to previous lives. And he wrote it. He was completely convinced that these were actual previous lives. And so I thought the contrast between this establishment psychiatrist and this very out there subject was interesting. But, I went into it, and my standard for whether to believe something is always, testable, reproducible, empirical evidence. And I wasn't impressed with his hypnotic cases. For one, if you've ever been hypnotized, it's basically saying relax and let your mind imagine stuff. So, and then all the things that the people came up with, they were like many generations in the past, and there wasn't any information that they came up with that they couldn't have gotten through many normal sources. Reading historical fiction, for instance, there wasn't anything that they sort of knew from their previous lives that they couldn't have gotten some obviously normal way. But when I was researching this topic, I came across Dr. Ian Stevenson, who was a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, and he was doing something that was way more interesting to me. He had spent 30 years going around the world investigating cases where small children began spontaneously to speak about what seemed to be previous. And that was really interesting. For one thing, his method was very dispassionate, very objective. He would go and interview witnesses and check the stories of the kids. So that interests me. Also, the fact that these were small children, sometimes just as soon as they could talk, they began to say this stuff. And so that really limits the sources of information that these kids could have. And then the other thing about it was that in most cases, the lives they were talking about weren't like, some 15th century slave girl or princess or something. They were just ordinary people from the previous generation, like a car mechanic who died in an accident. Or just a farmer or somebody who lived in a slum. So, again, all of these factors made them much more ripe territory for providing what I thought might be more convincing evidence that these were real cases.
And so this book was published in 1999. It's reaching its 25th anniversary. Congratulations! We have a new Spanish translation coming out, and it's really wonderful.
And in fact, there was also a 25th anniversary that just came out, for which I wrote a afterword about how do I feel about this 25 years later.
We're going to get to that in a moment. How you feel about it, Jim?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Yeah, I look forward to that forward and the update on your book. It was a very well. I'm curious how well it sold because in my community it's well known. People really enjoy that.
But let's
It comes
get
from
your
fascinating.
interest. Let's hear your
Yeah,
interest
yeah, yeah.
first.
Path
Right.
was very similar to Tom's actually. Except that my first choice of career was creative writing. I wanted to be a writer, but I found that I really couldn't make a living at it. So I looked around for a nonfiction subject. I noticed in my reading of fiction that rebirth, reincarnation continually came up as a theme. Sometimes it was metaphorical, and sometimes it was sort of a literal reincarnation or rebirth. And I was intrigued by this. This was some time ago. This was around 1980. And I started reading on reincarnation, and like Tom, the first thing I found was the regression, but like Tom again, it didn't really persuade me. When I found Stevenson's stuff, it was much more interesting, and I became engaged in the academic side of this, the study of reincarnation through children's past life memories. I would add to what he said, it's not just the memories. When Stevenson went into the field to study these cases, this is what he did. It wasn't regression. He was actually going into the field and studying the kids. He quickly realized that it's not just the memories that they're talking about. They also have behaviors. They behave like the people that they claim that they were. There's sometimes their physical signs also. So I was really, really intrigued by that in emotional responses. The kids, particularly when they go back and meet previous families, they respond to them just like the previous person did, the person whose life they recall. And so the whole psychology really intrigued me, and was what I think that's what intrigued Stevenson too, actually. That it was much more. As he got into this, he realized there's much more involved in this than simply memories. And that's what kept him with it. It's what's kept me with it.
Matt.
Well, I don't know a whole lot about past lives, um, although I'm certainly interested. My main gig is something far more boring, getting people loaded up on psychedelic drugs to see what types of effects they have. So this is one of those topics that make what I do look boring. But I have had a long-standing interest in parapsychology or psi phenomena, and probably know least about the past lives phenomenon because it lends itself least to the type of things I study, bringing it into the lab, replication. But just a little bit, I'll tell you about my interest. I think it was about 2007, 2008. A buddy of mine at Hopkins just came by the office and said, "Johnson, read this. What do you think?" And it was this paper by Rupert Sheldrake on this experimental design that you could people testing the phenomenon of saying, "Oh, I was just thinking you hadn't thought of that person for like 6 months, but I was just thinking of you," and then the phone called and it was you. And there's an experimental paradigm with a set number of trials, and I just read paper after paper, and it led me some books. I remember probably the first one was a Dean Radin book. Just delving into this area. I'd gone under this. I'd had my PhD for some number of years at that point. I always assumed that this stuff was real. And I had a psychology undergraduate and PhD and master's. You'd learn about it first thing in intro psych class. There can't be anything here, but the more I went into the rabbit hole, I thought, wow, this stuff is like so well in terms of experimental design. Either people are straight out complex fraudsters, or there's something here, or something just very mysterious where they're fooling themselves. So I took it home and I did the experiment with my wife, who was always, she doesn't have the incredible interest that I have, but it seems like if there is a phenomenon there, it kind of runs in her family. She's from the Appalachian Mountains, and genuine hillbilly, and she kind of has a little bit of The Shining, if it's a real thing, and but she's also not too obsessed with it. I mean, I was like, oh, if this works, it changes our conception of the entire nature of reality. And she's like, yeah, it'll make a cool story at a cocktail party, But yeah, we had highly significant results, ran 24 trials, and she correctly predicted the p-value for the stats nerds was like 0.002. On my only replication of this stuff, Rupert Sheldrake had published. So anyway, that opened up my mind very strongly to just the idea that there could be something to these other phenomena that sound crazy and they may not fit our current conception of reality.
So the term of art that each of you used as we're going around the horn here was past lives, right? And it's an old idea. Pythagoras has his metempsychosis and the transmigration of souls, and there are all these very ancient perceptions of this idea. But I'd like to get a little bit more specific. What do we really mean when we talk about past lives? Do I have a past life? Is a child remembering her own past life? Is this Cleopatra? Is this in the like? What are we talking about? If we kind of get down a little bit more into brass tacks here, can we get a more technical handle on this? Maybe we can go around again.
Well, I mean, in the children who I was present, studied with Stevenson, we're thinking about, for instance, one was a little girl who remembered the life of a woman who had, at the time she was born, already grown daughters, and this woman had died, had actually come to Virginia for heart surgery and not survived the operation. She lived in Beirut, Lebanon, and so she remembered being married to this woman's husband and having her 7 children. Another boy who's a young man at the time I met him remembered the life of an auto mechanic who was driving with his friends around something called Military Road in Beirut, and they got in a little road rage incident, and they got driven off the road, and he was killed in the thing. And then another was a little boy who remembered the life of a teenager who was caught up in Lebanon's civil war and who was killed at a artillery emplacement, killed actually by American artillery shells. We had parked a ship off the coast, and the government had told us, oh, those are Syrians up in those hills, so we just bombed the hell out of them. And it turned out they weren't Syrians, they were Druze, local Druze people, and we killed a lot of them. So that was the kind of just very mundane, ordinary lives that these children remember.
Can you add to that, Jim? Is there?
Yes, it's not just they remember these lives. What Stevenson did is...
and Stevenson, can you...
Ian Stevenson?
Yeah, we'll just introduce a little bit more to everybody here who we're talking about.
Right. Well, he's a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia who became interested in this phenomenon, and Tom accompanied him on several of his field trips. In
Okay.
fact.
All right.
Yeah. So what these children don't just recall the previous lives; the lives that they recall actually can be identified. And so,
In some cases.
in some
there
cases,
are many cases
right?
they
That's
can't,
true.
but in
Yeah.
some cases, they give specific names of towns and families, and those families very often discovered that children were making these claims, and they would meet. And in many cases, children would, like the little girl I was talking about, remembered the wife of a woman who died in heart surgery. Her daughter, they were an upper class family, and they thought, well, is this a scam to get money out of us? So the adult daughters made a surprise visit to this little girl's house, and they told me that the first thing she said to them was, she called them by their names, and she said, finally, you've come to visit me. And the first thing she said to them was, did your uncle give you the jewels that I had asked him to do? And that totally convinced them, because only their family knew that before she went into the surgery that killed her, their mother had asked her brothers, told her which of her jewels they wanted which daughter to have. And so nobody else knew about.
So,
If I can just add a little bit to this. Yes, this is extraordinary part of the phenomenon. The kids will remember things that no one knew except for, you know, maybe close people in the family, maybe only themselves. They will sometimes show where things were buried, money was buried, valuables were buried, other things of this sort. At any rate, what I wanted to add was once the previous person is identified, it becomes apparent that the children have carried over more than just memories. They've carried over personalities. They've carried over behavior patterns, and so forth. Things like this. So it's much more than just memory involved. So it becomes difficult to explain them simply by psi, by ESP. Something more than that seems to be required to explain them.
but let me ask, maybe Matt, you can chime in on this, knowing what you know and what you study about those strange pathways the brain can sometimes take. Is there a, I hate to use a term, quote unquote, scientific, because what is scientific, right? But is there, I think we kind of, we'll just use it as I think we kind of all understand what this means. Could there be some sort of scientific explanation for this? And of course, the follow-up question, of course, for all of you is, the question of hoax. The question of to what extent might that play into this? But let's start with the scientific part of it in terms of your understandings.
Yeah, as far as I know, there's no scientific explanation from, and your caveat applies, by everything we know about the brain, everything we know currently about physics. So my assumption that any sort of mechanistic explanation necessarily, it's going out there. It's speculating on, some quantum phenomenon, given the quantum nature of reality. The physicists who speculate about, or who seem convinced that there are multiple dimensions. Perhaps we're existing in multiple dimensions, besides time and space that we're not aware of.
Yeah, didn't the Russians just had this dream experiment that it was just reported 2 days ago in the news, where you had two people in different locations, with you had a dream suggestion that was passed from one to the other. This was just reported by the mainstream media. So clearly, science is transforming, no doubt.
Well, and the thing that I remind people of is that, our modern world, almost everything would look like complete magic. I mean, some of it a mere 10 years ago, but not to mention 50, 100, 500 years ago. So, we were always assuming that we figured out 99% of reality and we're chipping away at that last 1%. But in reality, I think we're probably nowhere close to the first 1% even now. And so it's that sort of humility. It's like, unless I completely understand how it happens, then I'm going to claim that this doesn't exist. So I consider myself a radical empiricist, a radical behaviorist, meaning you can test the phenomenon without having, like, most of our scientific discoveries are made before we know how it works. Before we, and some of the medications that we use that have been in use for a half century, we still don't know fully how they.
We don't know how Ozempic works.
Right. And yeah. So, we need to have some humility. And I think that's something scientists are horrible at. They are convinced that unless you can map out that entire pathway of mechanism, they're not. Not only are they going to think it's probably not true, that would be fine, but it's not even worth their time to look into. And I think, hey, like with some of these phenomena, just look at the evidence. And my assumption with hoax is that even if you think there's a reality to some of these things, it doesn't mean that 99.9% of fortune tellers aren't full of crap. And just, because cold reading is real and all kinds of sophisticated psychological techniques are real to be able to hoax people. That also doesn't, because that's going to happen because people are people. That in of itself doesn't mean that there's not also a real phenomenon.
Jim, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I would like to. Actually, Matt, you make a very good point here. And that is we need to be led by data. Now, your question was really a loaded one, because what is science, after all? I mean, you're making the assumption here, it seems to me, that science is materialistic science, and that's the only thing that counts as science, is materialism. But the assumption of our current sciences is based in this materialist idea that the brain, the physical is all that it is. The brain generates consciousness. And when you take that point of view, then yes, the things we're talking about, you know, everything parapsychological, certainly survival of death, reincarnation makes no sense. It cannot be explained. But when you allow yourself to be led by data, as any true scientist should, you're right. I mean, you know, the theory should come later. The data you should start with the data and then try to explain the data and build up your theory, test your theory. That's what science ought to be. If that is the way you approach science, then what Stevenson did is scientific, in my view, because he studied these cases very systematically. They're more than just the type of case studies you get in medicine or psychology. He actually interviewed multiple people, first-hand witnesses, you know, took notes, collected documents, and so forth. And then after he had many hundreds, thousands of cases, he started looking for patterns in the cases. And the patterns then led to theories, you know, and we're still working on the theory part of it. But this to me is a science.
Can we go there for a second? I mean, let's then take the science for granted, you know, the repetition of results. What is the theory of the case?
There is none.
Well,
And that's really the problem.
Well, we have to, this is, then I'll respond.
You know, the thing, especially in the last years, more and more sophistication in the study of the brain and the study of neurology, and all of it points in one direction, that everything that we think and do and feel is a physical process in the brain. They found that they were able to identify the exact physical portions of the brain that are imprinted on rats that have learned a maze through being shocked. And not only have they identified where those are, but they were able to actually take them out of the brains of the rats who had been trained, insert them in the brains of rats who hadn't been trained, and the rats who hadn't been trained reacted in the maze exactly as if they had been shocked, which suggests that even our memories are physical things. And of course, if everything feel and say and do are physical things, then death is the end of that, and there's no way that it can be transferred. On the other hand, there are all these cases, thousands of cases, and there are more all the time. They're not even that rare, of these children who are coming up with this information that it seems like there's no way they could know. And that's why, that was the main reason I went with Stevenson on these field trips, was I thought, well, either he's a fraud, or these kids are hoodwinking him, or the parents are putting them up, or there's some cultural imperative to support the local beliefs in reincarnation, and they are making these cases up. Well, every case that I personally interacted with, these people didn't care what we thought. They didn't want to convince us of anything. They seemed completely sane. You know, they were just telling us their experiences. And in some cases, they were very compelled to not believe them. It was really like, for instance, if a Muslim family had a kid who remembered being a Hindu, this was a huge embarrassment to them, and they would want to suppress it. There was a case where a little girl was beaten by her parents for telling them that they weren't really her parents, because they thought it was disrespect. And yet, you know, these things continued to happen in spite of all that. And also, and people would say, well, why aren't there that many cases in the West? Well, at the time, you know, you could say, well, wait a second. If you're saying that a cultural belief in reincarnation can create these false cases and create, then why wouldn't a cultural disbelief in reincarnation cause suppression of real cases? I mean, if one could happen, the other could happen as well. So this is what I wrote in my update after 25 years, is that science keeps more and more showing that we are physical beings. Our personality is a physical creation of the brain, and that dies at death. But on the other hand, nobody has come up with an explanation for this phenomenon of small children who are coming up spontaneously with these claims, many of which can proven to be accurate about people that they didn't know, about dead strangers.
Well, let me throw this over to Matt for a second, maybe in terms of your experience of the relationship between what would be called hallucination and what would be called reality, and how those two things can often combine in ways which we would not, or we think of them as two separate realms. But in fact, what the theory of the case here is showing is that somehow it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah. Probably the first thing to be aware of is that you can consider our conscious experience as sort of a controlled hallucination. I mean, we've known for, a long time that colors don't exist. It's just, different wavelengths of the EM spectrum. And it's, sound doesn't exist. It's just vibrations amongst molecules, and all of the other senses is similar. We really don't know we don't have any direct experience with reality itself. Now, another interesting thing is that when we are sensitive to consensus reality, we all seem to think there's a table here, we put our hands on it, none of the hands are going to go through, presumably. Whatever reality is, even though it's not this brown thing that I'm perceiving, my perception is correlated with something out there in whatever reality is. And presumably, because we're organisms of the same species, there's enough of a correlation between this divide of whatever we are, our consciousness is, and ultimate reality that we're able to navigate and say, oh, see that brown, table, Tom? He's like, yeah, I see the brown table. But that doesn't mean we know what reality seems to be constructed. It seems to be constructed from threads that are out there. But even, most of our eyesight, we're filling in. We have these saccades in the eyes, so the eyes are moving around, and we're filling in all kinds of information. That's happening in the visual cortex, where there's processing of our visual information, but we have this conscious experience of a coherent, unchanging visual landscape. But that's not what's coming directly from our
well, the point I'm trying to make is that if these are hallucinations, does that mean they're not real? In other words, are these mutually exclusive categories?
And we're getting to the area where sort of like what define real. So it gets real. It goes down.
Look at our politics; it's pretty hard these days.
Rabbit hole. And I will say, according to Tom's explanation, I agree that the correlates of phenomenal consciousness with brain function is really, really, really strong. But the one big caveat, and it's a huge caveat, we still haven't solved the hard problem of consciousness. In other words, we don't know why creating this system, essentially this really complex computer, there's no reason to think that if we created something just as complex that there would be an experience there. Like you could have a program running all of this complexity without there being an inside, so to speak.
Well, I actually have an idea about how that works. It's like a simulation. For our organism is not one entity. We're a bunch of disparate cells, and they change over time. Everything about us is different than it was 5 years ago, and yet it's very helpful to have this illusion that we are a single entity. It helps you to make sense and learn from your past and to plan for your future. So, just as these macaque monkeys had to figure out that, they could take a rock and smash open a shell and get to the nutrients inside of it, they had to sort of have an abstraction of what the rock was. The rock had properties. It was hard, broke things. The shell had properties too. It was hard, and yet if you broke it, it had nutrients inside. So they ran this simulation. How did they know that they could use a rock to smash the shell? Well, they ran a simulation in their mind. And we got more and more sophisticated in our simulations until suddenly we were running a simulation of ourselves as being an entity that had a continuation from birth to death, which is really not true if you look at the details. So I think that basically, we've created ourselves as a narrative, and we're basically our fictions. But that doesn't mean it's not valuable or it's not has overwhelming power. But basically, it's the stories of our lives. In fact, if you think about what is it that you don't want to lose when you die, it's our whole story of our whole lives.
So this gets me to the endlessly recurrent journalistic question, which the editors are always bothering me about, which is, so what? In journalism, we always say, well, they're always saying, well, what is the so what? Like, so what? So what?
So what? Well, there are a number of issues that have been here. One that on the hallucinate, how do you know that these aren't hallucinations? Well, they check out, right? If hallucination normally is something, it's just a fantasy. If the children, and it's not just children, by the way, it's adults too, that we now know are having these memories. If the memories actually can be verified and the people that they claim to have been can be found, that's pretty good evidence that those aren't hallucinations.
But what I'm asking, Jim, is given all that, okay, I believe you.
Right.
So what?
Okay, so what? Well,
yeah, you're not answering my question.
Yeah, before I get to this.
And I don't mean that in a hostile way. I mean, what is that? I mean it in a very
Right,
large,
okay.
capacious way.
So what? Or let me answer that question, by backing up to some of the other issues that have been talked about. It's not just, the experiments now show that bacteria are able to learn. Okay, bacteria do not have brains. They do not have nervous systems. If they can learn, they can remember. That should tell us, but philosophers who deal with this really haven't caught on to this yet, but that should tell us that memories are not stored in the brain. They're stored somewhere else. Now, the workers with this like to imagine that they're sort of chemically transmitted. They still have this materialistic idea. But maybe, after all, memories are stored in consciousness. And if memories are stored in consciousness, and not just memories, but maybe personality traits, information about a person in general, their personality traits, their behavioral dispositions, and so forth, all the things that we see expressed in these cases. If all that information is recorded in consciousness, then what we need to understand is how consciousness survives death, right? And what the bacteria, and there's some quite serious suggestions now that in fact consciousness is a part of going back even beyond single cellular organisms, back to the primordial ooze from which life first arose, that consciousness was in play there. So I think we need to think of consciousness as being part of all life, right? It's not just organisms like humans and mammals that have brains, right? It's all life. Okay. Now, if we take that premise and we then bring reincarnation into it, what that implies is that reincarnation has been with us perhaps since the very beginning of life, right? Now, I would not want to suggest that all of life has a human type of consciousness. I don't think it does. You know, I think that all different species of life have their own type of consciousness. And that consciousness has evolved just as form has evolved, right? You know, and to work with form, right? So reincarnation is within species lines.
The ghosts are at work.
So yeah, let me tie this up quickly. So Tom was saying that there's no theory yet. I think we are working on theory now, and this is part of it. That consciousness, the body dies, right? Consciousness, if it's separate from the body, lives on. It lives on until it becomes affiliated with, possesses, reincarnates within another physical body. When it does that, it brings with it all the stuff that's in the consciousness, right? And we don't have to think of consciousness just being conscious awareness. We can also think of it being subconscious. And when we're talking about very primitive organisms, we're talking about really subconscious activities.
I think
Let
that,
me,
let
let
me,
me take exception here. You know, you're just like throwing out words like consciousness that don't have any kind of definition, no evidence for their separate existence.
On the other hand, we all know that we have consciousness.
Well,
Even
it could
though
be
we
exactly
don't know
exactly as I had explained it, which is it's a simulation that our brains create, just like they create a simulation of a rock breaking a clamshell.
But why would the simulation need an experience? Because you can create simulations
Because-
in
because
computers. I
it-
mean, AIs are, they call them
Because you
hallucinations.
collect your experience for the practical purpose of learning from it and of making plans and of visualizing yourself in the future. So you have to have a self to visualize doing things in the future so you can make these plans. But anyway, regardless, there is no evidence of consciousness being
Right.
separated. None whatsoever.
I disagree with that.
Well, I
And
understand that you disagree.
there's
You
a
mentioned
few-
you mentioned the bacteria that seem to be able to learn. Well, those are all what they're finding is that those are all these complex chemical reactions that have these amazing abilities to react to the environment. And really what they're finding is that there isn't that clear definition between non-living and living because life starts with these chemical reactions that start self-organizing.
so Tom, you're speaking, you're speaking like a skeptic here, and you're the writer of the book about this phenomena. So I'm confused.
I'm confused too. And the thing is that, you know, you on the one hand, you have things that you can empirically investigate and come up with evidence for something. And on the other hand, you have these kids who are saying, and there's evidence that they're telling the truth, right? So, you know, what I often think of is if you sit a dog down with a calculus textbook and spend an eternity trying to teach the dog calculus, that's never going to happen. And I don't see why we would think that our brains are any more capable of understanding the complete reality of the universe than a dog's brain is capable of understanding calculus. I've had personal experiences that make me think there's absolutely no rational explanation for it. And yet, you know, they're like billion-and-one coincidences, and yet they happen. So,
But is it really beyond us? I mean, is it really beyond us? Is it really the fish trying to learn algebra, or the monkeys
well, why
typing
not?
typing Shakespeare?
Why would you think it wasn't?
Because, well, I just think and I think I'm the biggest skeptic of all of you sitting up here. But by the same token, I look at history and I see that for a long time, people have been trying to do this. People have been trying to get around death in some way, shape, or form, try to make what was gone return. Is there maybe some sort of psychological explanation for this? Matt, do you have a sense of?
Sure. And
like,
I'm
there's
sure we all,
desire?
yeah, because none of us want to die. I mean, any volunteers, not me. I mean, yeah. And so I think that's an easy explanation that the existential anxiety that we presumably, the humans have that my dog thankfully doesn't have. It's blissfully unaware that it's this living in this blink of an eye between, birth and death, and there's going to be nothing ever more after that. And so, this type of thing, or the belief in life after death, could, yeah, the rationale is there, the motivation is clearly there. I'm not saying that proves that it exists or doesn't exist, but yes, there's a rationale for why one
There's a
would.
psychological rationale, and there's also, it seems to me that, particularly when I hear Jim speak, there's almost a religious or a quasi-religious overtone or undertone to this whole thing. In other words, what is this spirit? What is this primal ooze we're talking about of consciousness? And why have people forever been trying to delve into it? Right? Maybe they're onto something.
Right. Yeah. Well, I try to follow Stevenson, and to get away from looking at this just as a religious phenomenon or as a belief system, to actually seeing, is there any evidence for it?
Why not religion? What's wrong with yeah?
Nothing is wrong with religion, but religion is about faith. It's about belief, as opposed to science, which is about testing ideas. And
There's no faith and belief in science.
well, yeah, I mean, I would say materialists definitely have faith in their materialism, and this is what keeps them from being true scientists. Many of them. A true scientist is one that follows data, and that explores everything in a rigorous way and reaches conclusions on the basis of the findings, rather than starting at the end, knowing what the end is, and everything has to fit into that. So I would, yeah, I mean, certainly the materialist theory counts as a theory. I was giving an alternative theory, because Tom said there's no theory. There is an alternative theory now.
There's no evidence for that.
Well, but you've contradicted that yourself.
No, there's evidence that these children are not making this up and that they're coming up with, but there's no evidence for a theory of why they're doing it. There's no evidence that there's such a thing as consciousness separate from the body. None whatsoever.
All right. I think, yeah, how familiar are you with the research that's been done in psychic research, parapsychology in general?
Well,
Over the last
I'm
150
pretty familiar
years?
with it. And I also understand that there's been a revolution in the understanding about how these tests were conducted. And what
do you mean by that?
Well, because what happened was that they did a number of methodologies in these tests, in these psychic tests. And if they didn't get good results, they changed the methodology. And then when they started getting some results, which were marginal, they wrote that up and said that, but if you went back and saw, and you say, okay, every time they don't get a good result, they change the methodology until they do get a good result.
Wait a minute.
Wait, Matt, what's Matt saying?
Wait a minute. Where do you get this?
There's been a whole huge controversy in
Yeah,
science over this in the last 10 years.
well, there's been a whole.
There's been dozens of papers written about it.
Yeah, but they're mistaken. Well, first of all, that's not the way that the things developed. But even if it was the way that things developed, what is wrong with the scientific procedure of if this doesn't work, you try it in a different way? I mean, this is what,
because it's presuming
but that's not
a preferred
this is what-
result. See,
yeah.
and that's what you're saying is that
P-hacking.
that in science you don't have a preferred result.
Well, that's right. But I'm saying, but
Let me
But this is
break in here
ridiculous.
for a second, if I may, just to break in. Like, what is there anything dangerous here, in the sense of like let's say you made up the result, or let's say you hacked the whole thing so that it came out the way you wanted it to, so that what you wanted to believe looked more true. I'm not saying it's true or not. I'm simply saying, what's the danger here anyway? What's at stake it's kind of like, it's another way of saying
Well,
this. So what?
know,
What's really at stake here in this? You're having an argument. Why?
Well, we're having a whole political argument at the moment about how we know what's real and what's true. And I think there's an awful lot of stake in saying something's true because you want it to be true versus something's true because, hey, I've tested it objectively and the evidence leads me to believe it's true.
Well,
And
So
yes,
what- yeah,
absolutely. But you know, in all areas of science, they've been finding fraud more and more. In fact, there's a great deal more evidence of this sort of fraud in areas other than parapsychology, partly because parapsychologists are very, very aware of the need to do their studies properly and not to allow this, and they police themselves very well. So there have been some very well publicized instances of this sort of fraud in parapsychology.
It's not really
No,
fraud.
no. I'd like to make a point here about the history of science.
Yeah.
About the
But-
history of science. So we all understand that there's what's called normative science, right? And then there's science which breaks those norms and changes those norms, and you have scientific breakthrough, right?
Sure.
We see this in the history of chemistry, the history of physics, and this is kind of
Geology,
geology is a great example, of course. So I guess my question is, and I couldn't, I don't think I think everybody would agree with you, Tom, that there's a lot at stake here in terms of what is real and what is not, and what is provable and what is not. By the same token, that doesn't preclude this idea of how can we break norms and move beyond normative science. And I think, Matt, that's kind of your
Yeah.
jam, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, I mean, very much, it's not quite as out there, but yeah, 20 years ago, the whole idea of like giving people psychedelics to help them with their addiction or depression sounded like crazy. So I'm very sympathetic to the marginalized scientific opinion. And again, I think it's radical empiricism. Be willing to test however you can something, and be willing to sit with that mystery of knowing, like, I may not be able to fully explain it. So for example, you're convinced it seems like there's a reality to past lives, but you're saying, I don't know how the hell it's happening, and no one does. I think that's an important a thing to admit, and I think scientists aren't that good at admitting it. So I think
But
that's
I think that, and I know this from psychedelic science as well, yes, the idea that psychedelics could be beneficial was non-normative, but the methods that they use to demonstrate that it is beneficial
are very normative.
Today they are.
Is
No,
the-
they're only normative now because within our context. Like, no, 2,000 years ago, nobody had to tell indigenous populations in this country about the scientific method to prove that using ayahuasca could be helpful in their lives. That's not that's anachronistic.
There were still
Okay.
basic contingencies, though. So scientific method is more of a systemization of these basic trial and errors that humans have always done. In a sense, my kid
And it's
trying to fix something on a
post-Newtonian.
table
That's
is an
post-Newtonian
experiment.
science. It's actually rather new.
Yes, the systematic way of testing contingencies. I do this. How does reality respond? And in a way that appreciates things like replication and manipulation. It should work if someone else does it besides me. So I think, and I will, this has fallen out of fashion, but I think there's something special to science. Yes, there are different ways of knowing, but nothing's going to get us to Mars like science. Nothing got us to the moon like science. Like, all the respect to the indigenous cultures and other ways of knowing, it's different. Science
I'm
is
sure
something
you know,
special.
this is an interesting, I mean, it's sort of related, but I'm sure you know that when to use ayahuasca, you have to do all sorts of very complicated things to make that work, including,
Yeah, the MAO inhibition.
yes,
combined
because
with
it
the
because
tryptamines.
because if you put it into the body just gets rid of it immediately, and it needs a completely different substance that's combined with it in
Two
a
different
very
plants.
specific way to make ayahuasca have the experience that you want to have. And so how did they know that in the jungle? You know, I mean, maybe they were like, you know, but they, you know, when you ask the shamans about how they knew it, they say, well, the plant taught us.
Yeah.
The plant
Now,
taught us.
and
how to
I'm
do it.
open to that. I'm also open to the idea when you read about indigenous cultures, they sample everything in the natural environment. I remember this from Guns, Germs, and Steel. He was stuck out with a native tribe, and they're about to eat a mushroom because they were cut off by a warring tribe, and he said, no, 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 don't eat. Some mushrooms can be poisonous. And they said, let us school you, white man. It's like, okay, there's 47 types. I'm making up some details of mushrooms that grow in this particular area, and this happens to be like, they knew everything about what you could eat. So that does give me a little
Starvation is
skepticism.
very strong motivation.
Right, right.
eat.
And that's the way you always did it. You eat a tiny little bit, and if you don't die, you can eat a little more. And if your buddy eats a little tiny bit, he turns green, you don't eat it. You know, we've been doing that forever.
So,
Yeah.
oh, yeah, Jim.
No, yeah, let me just pick up on this point and bring it back to, you know, take the indigenous cultures and bring it back to the subject of the past life memory. You know, I'm an anthropologist, right? That's my degree is in anthropology. And I went into anthropology after I had been reading and studying on reincarnation for a while. And what jumped out at me immediately is how in indigenous cultures around the world, where you have the reincarnation beliefs, you have the very sorts of things that Stevenson was finding and studying. You have the, you know, past life memories sometimes, you have behaviors, you have birthmarks, you have the very phenomena that he was studying. And in these indigenous cultures. And so what I began to realize is that's where the belief in reincarnation in the indigenous cultures. They were like scientists. They were observing this, and they were concluding from what they observed the idea of reincarnation. And then what happened was, as societies became more developed, the reincarnation beliefs became more elaborate and became more and broke away from just this empiricist.
What are you saying about Christianity?
No, I mean, like in Buddhism or Hinduism and the religions like this, it's more of a it developed. It got away from just the empirical ground.
Was it really, and I don't know, that pervasive in indigenous cultures, because my lens from the psychedelic field is that there's a whole tendency to view indigenous cultures as this monolithic thing. Even the concept of shamanism really is kind of a misnomer. It's not like one thing that existed. And there's so much variation. Like most of the Native American tribes stayed away from psychedelics, and it's not because they didn't know they weren't there. They were aware of them. There's just a lot of variation. So I'm curious. I wonder how pervasive the
about
belief.
50%, 50 to 60% of all over.
That's
the world.
that's a lot.
That's a lot.
Yeah,
that's a lot.
I mean, and it's not just cultures that believe in reincarnation. There's plenty of cases here in non-believing areas.
Oh, and that's something else I wanted that we sort of skipped over. It is actually much more common in the West than we ever realized. I say this on the basis of social media. Now that we have social media, Facebook, all the others, people are talking about this.
A friend of mine at the Washington Post she was going to do a Halloween story about all the weird things, spooky things that kids say. And so she was collecting this, online, and she ended up running 30 things. 8 of them were children who were speaking of previous lives.
Yeah.
Why children?
Huh.
Why is this so focused on children?
Yeah, that's a good.
Again and again. What do we make? Tom, you go.
Well, I mean, you have the situation where they're just spontaneously coming up with this, and that, you don't have
Kids make shit up.
You don't have a 70-year-old man who suddenly spontaneously starts.
My kids make all sorts of shit up.
Do.
Well, my point is that this is just something that people notice when their kids start saying, "You're not my real mom. You're not my real dad." I lived in a town 40 miles away, and my name was different, than it is here.
Yeah, my kid told me that. I told him where to go.
Well, my son used to say when I was a daddy, and I treated it as a grammatic issue. I said, no, you mean when you're going to be a daddy. And after a while, he stopped saying it.
Yeah, well, Stevenson was interested in children mainly because with the children, you could more easily rule out the possibility that they learned through normal means, through hearing about these other people, right? The things that they were saying, right? And so it was more evidential. But he also studied some cases of adults, and what we know now that we're paying more attention to them is that adults also have these memories.
And did those adults have those memories when they were kids?
Sometimes they did,
Okay.
and sometimes it was just a behavior that later on, I mean, I studied a case where the memories only came to a woman in her 50s, right? But going back, you can see from early childhood behaviors that were related to the memories that she later had. And one of the things that's really interesting about her case is it was following an NDE.
I would say I would just, on principle, be much more skeptical of the adult just because our ability to convince ourselves of something is so high.
Right, especially if you've had a
certainly-
recurring behavior your whole life and that doesn't have an explanation,
Right.
you tend to come up with one. Just like, and that's the thing, and Stevenson also had a lot of cases. I mean, I have two thick volumes along of cases of reincarnation where there's some correlation between a mark on the body of the subject and the life of the person that they remembered. But and so that's, he's saying, well, then now that's physical evidence that, how can you explain it away? But on the other hand, if you have a prominent mark, you're going to be looking for some explanation of it. And if you encounter a case of somebody who had a life, who had, let's say, an injury that caused death, that would have created a mark that was somehow analogous to that, then you might start identifying with that person. So,
well, of course, but from reading those books that's not.
well,
what
in
he
some
did.
cases, it's very hard to make the argument.
Yeah, but
I mean, they're amazing.
Out of his he had 230 cases in that book, and maybe you can find a half dozen you can question in that way.
So what are the correlations? Like let's say we talk about past lives, and what is it? Does this correlate with ESP, with magic, with telepathy? Or is this a completely different category?
Let me answer that. It correlates with memory. We see this. It's very clearly so.
So
I mean,
I'm sorry, with memories for
with
those,
memory.
or memory ability, because we all differ.
Well, no, I mean,
because we differ in the number of digits we're able to remember on average.
I can't remember anything
Right.
anymore.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
I'm bad at
Yeah.
it. Or do you mean like specifically memory for these?
I mean, when we look at the patterns of the past life memory, we see things like remembrance bones, which means that the past life memories tend to cluster in the last period of the previous life. Just like in our present life memories, we tend to remember things most clearly that are the most recent.
Okay.
Or they can be, many of these memories come in the waking state or in dreams. Memories of our present life can also appear in dreams. Memories that come in the waking state are often like just flashbacks, just flashes, right? The same way with many of these of the past life memories, they're just flashes, particularly with the older children. And so memory researchers talk about episodic memories and other kinds of episodic memories. You can analyze past life memories in very the same way.
But is it? I mean, I think Fred's question, it was a good. I'm not sure if that addresses his question. Like, is it correlated with something, either a typical phenomenon or one of these other extraordinary phenomena like ESP, telepathy?
Well, it's not.
I mean,
Yeah.
because I want to start to
Mediums,
get at
you know,
theory, like
in other words,
whatever this thing is.
Right. Well,
Is there a commonality?
Right. What I'm trying to say is ESP functions very differently. These memories do not look like ESP. They look like memories.
let me, since we don't have all the time in the world, unfortunately, I do want to kind of throw something out to all of you and hear your opinions about it, kind of a go round, and then maybe we can open to questions if you like. Um, oh, we have plenty of time. I'm hearing we have lots of time. Well, let me throw out this question anyway, which is our friend Newton, the father of modern science, right? He really didn't spend most of his life doing physics. No, he spent most of his life looking for the philosopher's stone and trying to count the number of days until the apocalypse.
No, and decoding the Bible.
Yeah, that's basically
he's-
what he spent most of his
his
energy
code.
on in his life. Wonderful. But then, of course, 300 years later, a lot of his physics, which seemed to be the weirdest thing he was doing, that's what comes through. So the question to all three of you is kind of, what is your time frame for when reality catches up to these ideas?
How about never? Is never good for you?
That's
That's a skeptic.
there you go.
Yeah, yeah. And I have a very different view on this. I see it happening now.
I'm shocked the two of you disagree.
Yeah, yeah. No, I really see it happening. I mean, I've been involved with this, what, 40 years now, more than 40 years. Over the last 10, 15 years, I've seen a lot of changes, a lot more receptivity. Things are changing.
Yeah, I'm more skeptical with this one than with these other phenomena, because again, you can't. This is all and like they could be some of the most convincing anecdotes in the world, but that's still another level of analysis than some of these other forms that I think there's something there from my reading of the literature, but maybe we're still sort of stuck in a quagmire with these other things like telepathy or but the purely anecdotal nature makes it an even extra layer of if we want to really open it up. I kind of like talk about the anomalous stuff. It's like if the aliens reveal themselves, at least that one would be
aliens.
like, but there's going to be no analogous thing of like, okay, there goes the flying saucer on the White House lawn, like if that were to happen, there's nothing I could see here that's really going to convince someone who's inclined toward to not be open, no matter how convincing the anecdote is.
Right. May I respond to this? The whole anecdote thing. Yeah, this is a skeptical line that these sorts of cases that Stevenson studied are anecdotes. An anecdote, I mean, that makes it sound as if he just went out and collected stories, right? He didn't. He talked to people. He verified what the children were saying, right? And he went and got documents, backing up, medical documents backing up the birthmarks and birth defects that Tom was.
But there's still
And so-
individual one-off cases. They're each one is
Well, okay,
unique.
but so
Which
that's where it starts. I mean, this is where the reincarnation research starts with these case studies, and these case studies are much more rigorous than what you find in case studies in medicine or psychology, where they probably
could I do?
And then
maybe what I'm saying is, could I do an experiment,
well, people yes,
not just an observational study? Like I can't even think what that would look like. Whereas you can at least, whether you agree with the results
Right,
or
and
not,
that's
you
a
can do an
huge-
experiment
No,
on telepathy.
okay,
And more and more case reports, also thoroughly investigated, are being accumulated. But that doesn't advance us anywhere. Stevenson had plenty.
okay,
There
yeah.
were thousands of them and hundreds that were really well documented. And like I said, you can, any single case, you could say, well, I must be missing something. I mean, obviously, this can't be true.
Could this be a
but when you
problem
have
in the
case
scientific
after-
method?
You have case after case after case, you begin to think, well, the idea that all of these have some explanation that we're missing becomes almost as hard to believe as the idea that it's something we don't understand.
Okay, this is what you're missing here.
Oh,
You
I'm
take the
not
case.
saying that I don't believe it. I'm saying to
Wait a
convince the
minute.
general public that's an extra layer. I'm not.
Right.
I'm not.
And the point I
making a
want
judgment
to make is that
myself.
you take the cases and you look for patterns across the cases.
Oh,
This is where you begin to make the next step into making it a science. You're looking for patterns, and then you take the insights from the patterns and build theory.
What
And then you
what
do-
patterns have you noticed?
Oh,
I mean, what I've noticed was that every time you thought you had a pattern, there are cases that contradict it. For instance, there was the idea that, people tend to remember violent deaths. There was only violent deaths in a small
Tom,
percentage of the.
Tom, you wrote a book about this. You don't believe this.
yeah.
No, I'm not. I'm
No.
saying I don't believe. I believe that there is something we don't understand, and that we probably
Okay, so
will
let's
never understand.
Okay, all right. So there's something we don't understand, and something we may never understand, right? And I think Jim is saying maybe we'll begin to understand it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a skeptic myself, but it just seems rather odd the position you're putting your own self in, being the author of a book which has probably convinced many people out there.
I'm
in the
back
world.
with the dogs and the calculus textbooks. I don't understand
I
why.
respect that,
I mean,
yeah.
dogs are smart, and their brains aren't that different from us.
So we're just not smart enough.
That is absolutely right.
Well, maybe in a year or so, we'll be able to throw this AI that's going to be smarter.
Oh yeah, AI will help. AI will solve it. Yeah, sure.
Thousands of these cases, and who knows, maybe some patterns
Or
will
maybe
emerge that.
maybe all our experience is the product of some alien AI that has created this simulation that we all think is real.
Yeah, I got to put the brakes somewhere here. Like, yeah,
May I say
but
something
the,
about the
but yeah,
patterns before we. May I say something about the patterns?
you may.
Okay. We the patterns really fall into two classes. One, patterns that relate to the previous side of the case, and patterns that relate to the subject side. Now, the violent death thing relates to the previous side, right? The person died violently. Nobody ever said that it was always violent deaths. We find violent deaths, though, in 50 to 60% of the cases. Now, that means that, and
That's of the cases where they even mentioned a kind of death. In maybe a huge percentage of the cases, people never talk about how they died.
let me go back.
no. Okay, well, yeah, I don't know if a huge percentage.
You had mentioned earlier, the idea that behaviors, that they had similar behaviors. Well, that's not always the case either. In some cases, somebody was the past life was a auto mechanic. And I said, well, how is he good with cars in this life? And he says, he's hopeless.
Yeah.
There's a lot of cases like that as well.
Not a lot, just a few. Yeah, I mean, it's not. Yeah, this is complicated.
that's
It's
part of-
not that
yeah.
the personalities do change from one life to the next. It's not the case that everything that all personality traits are going to carry over exactly to the next life. But what we see is change is very similar to the changes that we go through in any given life.
Let me ask the three of you. Let me ask, what about social benefits? What are the social benefits of skepticism as opposed to the social benefits of belief? In other words, why do we feel like, oh, we have to be skeptical and we have to say no? Or why do we say we should consider this? We should think about aliens. We should think about we should think about all this because that would be embracing X, Y, and Z. And I think, Tom, you're right. I think there's a political thing going on now where we have to start considering to what extent is it socially. What's the effect socially of saying, well, we don't need scientific method to believe something, or on the other hand, to say we should embrace all sorts of different opinions. What do you think, Matt? Let's start with you because I'm sure that in terms of your own research, you're probably under a certain level of pressure. It's like, why are you even in this business?
Yeah, I think you clearly need both. And I think probably if you explore the large majority of reasonable people, they would admit you need both. Without some skepticism, none of us are going to walk out of this room with their bank account with any money in it. Like, you're going to be fleeced out of money minimally. And, so, you can't believe everything and you can't disbelieve. I mean, I could just spend my whole life saying there's no proof there's this table here because, like, oh, after all, it's just EM.
Descartes did that.
Yeah, and so the question is, like, where is an individual going to you know, how are they going to calibrate that balance? It's a signal detection theory problem. You know, there's a ground truth, and there's going to be, you know, we're either going to correctly identify a pattern that's really there, or we're going to like fail to pick up on a pattern that's really there, or we're, you know, we can, you know, falsely find a pattern, convince ourselves there's a pattern that's not there.
But we're in a moment, we're in a social moment where some people are convinced of certain patterns and other people are not convinced of those and will deny those patterns. Where do we have, where must we stand right now? And this is just kind of a test case for, well, we don't really know this is the case, but we should believe it anyway. Or we don't know this is the case, and so it's really, we can't believe any of this.
Well, at the meta level, societally, I think an important thing is that we should actually be encouraging people to think for themselves. There's a lot of push in science to just believe the authority.
I think we should be pushing them
and
not to
making
think
fun
for
of people
themselves.
for doing their own research, and I think that's a horrible thing to
Yeah.
do. We need to do a better job at presenting, you know, if we think someone is wrong, presenting the case, but don't try to squelch dissenting voices. I think I see that as a really scary trend these days. So with this too, with everything, just, you know, let people speak, critique
Well,
what you.
Let me talk to Jim. No,
But
let me talk to
also-
Jim for a second, because I think Jim has been faced with most dissent today. You have been, and so you have been faced with the most dissenting voices. What's your sense of this? Do you welcome the dissent, or do you?
Yes, very much so. I think skepticism is very healthy, but I think that at the same time, we need to follow the data. Coming back to what we were saying, we need to follow the evidence. And where we get into trouble is when the skepticism is so profound that it doesn't allow us really to do that, right? You know, if we're too close-minded, you know, then it's not helpful. But we do need to be critical-minded. We do need to be critical.
Tom?
All Stevenson wanted was for more serious scientists to look at these cases and try to figure them out.
That's right.
And instead, what a lot of people did was they said, well, reincarnation is absurd. It can't happen. Therefore, we don't need to pay any attention at all these cases. But these cases are really impressive. They're really something. And there's smarter people, a lot smarter people than I am, who maybe they could figure out a way to move this forward rather than just collecting more cases. I mean, there was a psychiatrist who interviewed these kids and did psychological profiles. They showed no, you know, they seemed slightly more mentally healthy than average. They were slightly more intelligent than average. There's no indication that any of them had, you know, major mental illness or anything like that. You know,
What is the scientific way forward here? I mean, I think that's the good point. I mean, like, is it psychiatry? Is it neuroscience? What is the way forward? Oh, I have a question, but we can't do questions yet because and you will be my first. No, because we don't have the microphones.
Microphone. Well, we have to answer. Trade them.
We will get let
getting
my
late.
phone, everything.
As a suggestion for a path to explain this phenomenon, I'm wondering about quantum physics, and I realize that can be a basket that everyone throws everything in as oh, we can find it there. But the findings of physicists examining the behavior of the very small stuff that we're made up of, everything's made up of, over the past 100 years, have come to some really bizarre conclusions. In fact, they don't quite know what to make of the phenomena. For example, non-locality. The suggestion strongly is that everything is literally connected. I just read a physicist on the subject. So when you look at the findings of quantum physics, it seems like there are the neurological sciences, medical sciences, biological sciences. My understanding is they're not talking to the quantum physicists. I'm not sure, by the way, that anything constructive could come of it right now. But it seems that the medical sciences and biological sciences are operating under a very mechanistic viewpoint of view. But the findings of quantum physicists, that is the behavior of stuff that everything is made of, is just really strange and would seem to open an avenue, a path.
So can I just ask the panel then, what do we make of that? How do we respond to this idea of quantum mechanics and its relationship?
Yeah, I think that's a good avenue to pursue. I mean, one of the problems as a professional scientist, I'm thinking, okay, where's the funding to do this? I mean, that really is like, I would like to see a lot of these really interesting phenomena that even if there's a 1% chance that they're true, would absolutely change our conception of reality. Like, why don't we want to put like a few $1,000,000 into this? And so yeah, one of the challenges I foresee with this is that, and I get this just within psychology and psychiatry, it's just like we don't have a good philosophy of science. Like the judicious use of constructs. What do we really mean by a word? You just get all of these, it's called jingle jangle fallacy, where either multiple words are used for the same thing, or you have multiple things fall under or described with the same word, like consciousness. I mean, that can, phenomenal consciousness, the source of the so-called hard problem, that is not the same thing as access consciousness, which is a question of like, you weren't thinking of your grandma, now you are just because I said the word. Where was that stored in the brain? How are you aware of it now? Or a sense of self-identity is something else referred to as conscious. These are all different phenomena that really shouldn't even go under the same word. And so that's just within philosophy. We should actually listen to the philosophers more when we get into these realms. All of the empirical scientists need to draw from philosophers in terms of rounding our language, especially when we get into these cross-disciplinary fields where we have psychiatrists and psychologists and neuroscientists working with quantum physicists. A lot of this stuff is so down the rabbit hole, we can just like spin ourselves out and we don't really know what we're talking about. We're using these words that are just to have no grounding.
So Jim,
Yeah,
you
but
want
the
to
same-
respond?
Right. Yeah, but I would say at the same time, the philosophers need to be grounded in the science. I mean, scientists should be paying attention to philosophy, but the philosophers have to do their part too. I think quantum physics actually is key to this. The founders saw consciousness. They understood. Okay, sorry, thank you. Yeah, no, I think quantum physics is really key to understanding what we're talking about here, the past lives and the reincarnation. In a couple of ways. One, the founders, after all, saw consciousness, I mean, however they understood it, as a key to quantum mechanics, right? We've sort of gotten away from that because too many materialist grounded scientists didn't want to accept that implication, right? That consciousness is involved. But so that's one way. In fact, and I'm blocking on his first name, Henry Stapp, is it? Is a quantum physicist who wrote a paper, a position paper, about the compatibility of quantum physics with personality survival. And that was my aha moment. That was what led me into thinking of what survives death as simply being consciousness. People say the soul. Well, what is the soul? When I think of the soul as consciousness, everything started to fall into place. The other way I think it's important is that I think actually in quantum biology, we'll find the answer to a lot of these reincarnation issues like the birthmarks and birth defects that we were talking about. I think that consciousness, is involved in, in affecting perhaps the genome, but definitely tissues or, I don't want to get too technical here, but in vascular birthmarks, which are the blood ones, or the melanocytic birthmarks affecting the melanin, that consciousness about what's called bio-PK, the biopsychokinesis in parapsychology, gets involved, with them, and that's part of the theory that I'm working on. So we do have a theory. It's a different one than the materialist theory, but it is a theory.
Well, we might have a theory, but it's a theory without any evidence. And the problem is that, that the quantum world is famously weird and mysterious. So every phenomenon that seems a little weird and mysterious, suddenly everybody's saying, oh, it's a quantum explanation. He mentioned the idea that consciousness is very important in the quantum world. Well, that came from the idea that, for instance, a photon is both a wave and a particle. And it becomes a particle when we measure it. And so originally people were saying, oh, well, it must be our awareness of it that makes it into a finite particle. But in fact, it doesn't require any consciousness. It just requires any interaction with a macroscopic measuring instrument. You know, the weirdness of the quantum world is weird on the very small scales. And what happens is when the billions and billions and trillions of quantum particles that interact to create the macroscopic world, the weirdness averages out. You know, it's like, have you ever seen those things where you drop balls into this kind of maze down and it has different passages, where it's like in a pyramid shape? And anytime you drop a ball, that ball could go in any of those slots. It's completely random. But if you drop 10 million balls in there, it will form a perfect pyramid. And that's what we're dealing with. You could do that experiment with 10 million balls in that thing. And theoretically, it could work so that it formed an inverted pyramid, you know, that the point was at the bottom. But wait, let me just finish. But you could do that experiment longer than the lifetime of the current universe, and you would never see that result. That it would take, 20 times the lifetime of the universe in order to see that result. And that's what quantum mechanics is like.
I love the idea of quantum biology, though. That's beautiful. Are there other questions we have in the audience here? Let's. I see some hands back there, and we have a microphone. We can move around, and I think we can share without coming to blows.
Thank you all. Mine's sort of short and sweet. What do you think we can learn from the collective NDE experiences? There's some commonalities, I would say, on those subjective experiences.
NDE just for everybody, can you?
Near-death experience, and I think also out-of-body experiences in general. People have fallen into trances, sometimes drug-induced, sometimes not, but have crossed over some sort of threshold. And I think there's some commonality between the experience that they're reporting. It's not all the way to reincarnation, but it's crossing over that threshold. And I'm just curious what you think we can deduce from that.
Actually, there is a fair amount of crossover, because in about 20% of the cases where the children remember previous lives, they also remember the period between death and rebirth. And a lot of the things that they talk about are very similar to what we hear in NDEs.
Matt, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I think that I'm most interested. The big question there is, of course, are these common phenomena a common biology of things that happen when the brain starts to shut down, when it's deprived of oxygen? And so what can we learn about those commonalities to start to get at this? That's the big question there. Is there something real that's beyond the brain, which is obviously the big interesting thing? The more we can understand what the brain is doing, the more we can potentially get at that question, is there something more? But I think, like, in terms of, like, we're such infants with the brain, there's so much we don't know about its basic function, including its dysfunction when it, like, at the time of death, that hopefully we'll learn more over the coming decades.
Do we have time for a couple more questions? We do. Okay.
So thank you all for your comments. Really interesting. Just a couple of questions for clarity. For Tom, I'm just trying to understand what you do believe. Is it, or if anything, do you believe that these stories that these children are telling are based on past lives, but you don't believe there's, but you just don't understand the theory and or the why, how it happens, and we don't know that, and we can't know that at this point in time.
Okay.
Or do you don't believe at all that
It-
this is even they're even
Right.
talking about past lives?
I believe that the children are not lying,
Mhm.
that they're not being put up to it. I mean, not all of them, obviously, but at least some aren't lying. They're not being put up to it. They're not crazy. So there's something authentic going on there. And I believe that we haven't the faintest idea what that actually is.
Okay, thank you. And then, Fred, I had a question just to clarify your question about so what. So it was that question basically, so even if this was true, if we knew that this was a phenomenon that some people do experience, some children from past lives, would it make a difference to us in some way? Would it
And
have
how,
some
and
benefit?
how would it
or
make a
harm?
difference? How would it
Okay.
make a difference to us? And how should we look at this? And what would that mean for us, the living, that we are getting messages from those who are no longer with us? That's all. How do we take that? So what?
It's not really a question. My name is Zeke Botokuma. I was trained as a philosopher. I teach philosophy at Morgan State University, and I will go home very happy as a philosopher based upon a statement made by one of you. And the statement was, I quote, "We should listen to philosopher more." And the problem is, in today's world, philosophers don't enjoy the same respectability as the past. That's a problem. So I will stop there.
No, but I think
I
this gets
agree.
kind of to the heart. It gets to the heart of a lot of what we were talking about, which is this kind of the language issue. The plain language that we have to discuss these issues is part of the problem.
So when you were all stuck on the question, what is science, and then you mentioned Newton and so forth, I came up with quantum too, and I'm not a scientist, but not as a solution to the problem, but as an analogy. So when Newton had mechanical physics, you could explain a lot of things, but then we came to the very small, and then we couldn't explain it anymore, like, the particle and wave issue and action on the distance and all kinds of stuff. And so, and then you can do experiments or you can do a thought experiment. And so Einstein famously did thought experiments, which were only later proven through real experiments. So only now did we actually measure with LiDAR, the differences on gravitational waves and so forth. And so as an analogy, I think we are here at the same point, that we are not being able to explain with our classical biology and chemistry and psychology, if one adds that in as a science, what these phenomena are or how they are, so that we would need a thought experiment, number one. But so it's what I'm trying to say is there's lots and lots of precedents in science for the case where you need a quantum leap, so to speak, in your theory in order to explain what you couldn't explain before. And you cannot explain it when you just stuck with your old ways of thinking. You cannot explain quantum stuff with Newton's mechanics. So this is where we are. And I'm just wondering why you are not using this analogy and this history of science that has over and over proven to be successful. And then we do learn new things, and we would not, I mean, I do think in infinity, we can learn all kinds of things. And we also learned that the dog is not as stupid as we thought.
Yeah, I mean, Thomas Kuhn called this the paradigm change in his 62 book. So yeah, like the entire, and one of the points that one of the key points he made is that you're not teaching, again with the dog, you're not teaching the old dogs new tricks. You're waiting for them to retire and pass away before a new generation can run with. And that was the case with the Principia of Newton and of, I mean, it was in the final pages in Origin of Species by Darwin that, like, he said, I don't even expect the, you know, the naturalist of today to get these ideas. I'm looking to the next generation. So yeah, I don't know, but the new paradigm can't just be made, you know, it has to be systematic. I mean, so it's not every day when you come up with a Principia or an Origin of Species. Like, it has to make a lot of sense, and it has to, in a more simple way, explain phenomena that were just sort of dangling before.
Well, I mean, if you, that's an excellent point about, you know, the quantum world couldn't be explained using Newtonian. So how did they get anywhere? Well, they observed very small particles and what they did and how they behaved and their puzzling behavior. And then somebody came up with a new kind of mathematical model where suddenly that fit all this weird behavior they were seeing. So in a sense, they've never understood, and they still don't understand quantum mechanics in an intuitive way, because our world is the macroscopic world. That's where our intuition is. But they do have this mathematical model that works, that predicts new things and makes possible all this amazing technology that we have, because it actually is right in terms of how it predicts these things are going to behave. But you can't say you, quote, understand it, because it's not in our experience. We have no way to make it intuitive.
And the other issue, to your point, which is a very good one, is you cannot predict or prophesy scientific revolution. You know, scientific revolution happens in all sorts, in Thomas Kuhn's point, it happens in all sorts of strange ways at strange times due to strange contexts. And a lot of it has to do with, as you point out, just the technology. And so we do live in a macroscopic world, but increasingly our context is based on microscopic technologies that it's very hard, it's almost hard to wrap our heads around what that is. And so perhaps as we look forward, you know, there might be technology which is going to allow us to, this is just purely hypothetical because I don't believe it, but it would allow us to see a soul, you know, to understand energy in a different way. You know, obviously, you know, 300 years from now, it's going to be a different universe. How much time do we have, Claudine? Do you tell me, like, because we can go till 9 o'clock, so we have time for more questions. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, and Jim, did you want to respond to that? So yeah, let's continue with questions.
So it sounds like the research that you're describing took place some time ago. I'm wondering, has anybody else done this since then? Like spoken to more children, gathered more evidence?
Yeah, there are plenty of new cases.
Yes, Stevenson died in 2007, but it didn't stop with him. I mean, I investigate cases, you know, and I'm not the only one. I mean, there's several of us now. I mean, and we publish in journals, peer-reviewed journals, you know. So this hasn't ended. You know, it's continuing to grow. It's continuing to develop. And new methodologies are coming forward where, you know, we're not just case studies anymore. Survey techniques are being used. Psychological instruments are being brought in more and more to study the cases and the phenomena. And we continue to work on theory and to test different theoretical models. So it's definitely continuing.
Okay, I recognize that we are in a university and that you guys are scientists and researchers, but I just wanted to maybe make a comment recognizing beliefs of other cultures. My grandmother explained this to me when I was probably about 7 years old. I grew up in Barbados, and sort of a mixture of religious cultures and African cultures, etc. But what she said was, when this happens, it is the spirit of a person who had an untimely death. And that spirit then looks for a new home to finish their life, and the likely place for that spirit is a child. The other thing that we have in our culture is that if somebody or a family member dies, you leave the windows of your home open all night to let that spirit leave. And so, that's just, I don't know how many other cultures have that sort of similar belief system, but I know you're looking for a research answer, but as a child, that was what we were taught to accept.
I think that's a those are beautiful ideas, right? And those ideas answer cultural requirements, right? And emotional requirements. And there's an emotional truth to that. Absolutely. And we can't neglect that. And certainly I don't think that's the point of science either, is to neglect emotional truths and cultural truths.
Yeah. And I would point out, I mean, to a certain extent, I mean, I think these types of beliefs are empirically grounded. People saw certain things and they made conclusions, and and so these beliefs developed from them. But it's not the case that all that all violent deaths, or that only violent deaths. I'm sorry? Untimely deaths. Right, untimely deaths. Yeah, right, untimely deaths. Right, okay, yeah, I know, I'm sorry. I missed that point, but yeah. So this actually ties into something that Stevenson noticed in his cases, and that is the great majority of them have some sort of unfinished business. Okay, very similar thing, and it's the unfinished business aspect much more important than the violent death aspect in making the memories memorable, right?
I mean, unfinished business is a pretty squishy concept, and plus, all the cases that I saw and looked at, there wasn't really any outstanding unfinished business in most of them. They were just but one thing that's really interesting, I think, about these cases in light of other cultures is that these cases happen across multiple cultures, and the cases are almost identical, whether they happen in like New York City or in some small outback town in India. They present the same way. The kids say the same kind of statements. And so to me, that really suggests it's some kind of natural human phenomenon rather than a culture created.
Particularly because these, as I said, I mean, we see these things in the anthropological literature too. They were recorded centuries ago, in some cases, by anthropologists, by missionaries, by observers in these cultures. They noticed these things. So we're talking about pan-human sorts of phenomena and behaviors, right? And so that's one of the things that makes it difficult to really dismiss it all.
Matt, did you want to comment on that?
Yes, certainly that's the type of pattern that the transcultural aspect. I mean, the big question is it real? Whatever that, and so
You of all people.
is it a hallucination? And so that, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, that suggests that it's a real phenomenon. It would be. I'm curious now. You got me thinking. How would you quantify unfinished business in someone's life? Because if that was a pattern, that would be interesting to see if that was really there. I mean, I would imagine all of us, unless we were 90 years old and died in our sleep, like most of us have unfinished business. Like I bet everyone in this room has unfinished business, but maybe there is something more than that. Maybe there really is some. How would you quantify that?
But there's also the theory, there's a theory here of the cloth and the sand, right? I mean, the sand, the grains of sand can give you all the evidence in the world, but it doesn't hold together. That Tom can collect as many of these stories as he likes, but that doesn't mean that they're threads that will actually make a textile that can hold together, right? There has to be a theory of the case if it's going to actually pulled together as a textile, as opposed, as a text, right? As opposed to just through your fingers.
I'm still trying to think of how to do an experiment without killing somebody.
Okay. Okay.
Unfortunately,
It-
that seems to be like part of it.
I
if
always,
you works it.
I always wished that an anthropologist would do a cultural study of a community where a lot of these cases happen and
Have
be
cases.
there and be there at the origin of the cases and be able to follow it through. Of course, as you pointed out, that takes a lot of funding, and
Right.
and I'd like to
Well,
see you try to
Live
get
with
that
this
funding,
tribe for a year or
5 or 10.
There have been a few cases like that where anthropologists have been able to observe them, from the beginning, but not many. You're right.
I think we have a
let me-
question all the way in the back.
Let me comment on the science just briefly.
Okay, then we'll go more.
Because that's come up a couple of times now. At the University of Virginia, they're thinking of and planning actually to study memories in the lab, just like we study this life memory. Take people who have past life memories into the lab and see how the brain it lights up, when they're remembering previous lives. Another thing that can be done that's being contemplated is looking internally at birthmarks and birth defects. Because one of the things that we know is that when there are gunshot wounds, there can be 2 birthmarks, one matching the entry wound, one matching the exit wound. And it would be very interesting to see if we can see the track through the body. Things like this can easily be done in the lab, and it just takes the funding, it takes the equipment, and the will to do it.
Okay, I think we have do we have a question all the way in the back?
This will be the final question of the evening.
So I'm very interested in evolutionary psychology. I was curious if there had been any research on the evolutionary benefit of remembering past lives, or if it was a byproduct of consciousness.
Yeah, okay, let me speak to that. My feeling on that is that the main benefit, well, I like the term conservation of consciousness. I don't think consciousness is energy, I think it's its own thing. But I think there is this conservation of consciousness the same way that there's conservation of energy. It's either embodied or it's not embodied. Move it closer, okay, I'm sorry. I don't know how much of that was missed. That consciousness, the conservation of consciousness, that consciousness is embodied and then it's disembodied and embodied again. But with reincarnation, I think we need to keep in mind that it seems to go, if my theory is correct, it goes back to the beginning of life, right? And so in trying to understand the purpose of reincarnation, the meaning of reincarnation, we have to ask, what would the purpose and meaning be for bacteria, right? And I think that it's not necessarily, spiritual growth that is talked about so much. When we look at cases, we really do not see much evidence for spiritual growth. I think reincarnation is probably more about facilitating adaptation to the new life, to the environment, because we see very often in these cases, and this has sort of come out with what we've been talking about, that very often the lives recalled are in the same general area, right? Or like the case that Tom started off talking about, where a woman died in Virginia, was reborn in Lebanon. Well, she was from Lebanon. She was a Jew from Lebanon. She went back home. The ties to culture, either from being reborn in the same place, the same culture, or going back there, suggests that reincarnation has something to do with, or with cultural continuity, right? And conversely, when we see cases, international cases, that are different, where there's no going back to the there are difficulties. People dislike the food, they dislike the clothing, they have difficulty learning the language. So reincarnation seems to be naturally occurring, in the same environment, and seems to be about more than anything else helping the organism adapt to that environment.
And Tom, you wanted to comment on that?
It's hardly as global. I was just going to point out that a lot of these cases that are, quote, solved, where they find the family of the previous personality, that the children might, very often they're unhappy with their memories, but when they find the family, they often stop being unhappy, and very often they just forget about the previous life. They seem like something's been resolved. But in some cases, they develop lifelong connections with the families of their previous personality. The one case I mentioned where the guy remembered the life of a teenager who was killed in the Lebanese Civil War. The family of the dead kid took this little boy and let him fulfill the function of eldest son whenever they had like some kind of, funeral or wedding or something. And so if you were an anthropologist and you were studying life among the Druze in Lebanon, and anthropologists love to do kinship categories, you would have to allow for a new kinship category of past life family, because this was a real thing for them, and it meant something to their lives. And the little girl in Lebanon who remembered the life of the woman who died in Virginia, when I talked to her, she was 20, and I said, well, do you still have the memories? She says, well, I don't really still have the memories, but I still have the feelings. And the whole family of the mother didn't want anything to do with this case because they found it embarrassing. And then when we talked to them, the father, who was the husband, who was an elderly man at this time, took us aside and said, she still calls me. And I had to tell her just last week not to call me anymore, not because I didn't want her to, but because I was afraid that it was stunting her romantic life.
Matt, do you have a comment about either emotional or cultural redemption through this activity?
Well, the question about evolutionary psychology, got me thinking. I mean, that's interesting. If this is a real phenomenon, whatever the mechanism of it, anything that natural selection can prey upon and utilize will be utilized over deep time. And so could this type of thing afford selection, particularly at the group level, which is a more sophisticated, idea, but does, if enough individuals in this culture have this phenomenon, does that afford some selective benefit through, I don't know, the preservation?
Well, sure. We've yet to even reach, we're not going to have time tonight to go over like the sociology of ancestor worship and ancestor reincarnation, this sort of thing, which clearly has a very strong function, ethnographically.
So it might be similar, yeah.
But I think that's about it for tonight. And all I can say is, great talk.
Wow, what fantastic. These guys, oh my goodness. Really, really, that was a great talk. Fantastic. Gotta thank you so much, all the different viewpoints. And I love what you do. And I'm just hopeful that this is all resolved in my lifetime, because, and you say, so what? And, I think it's very comforting to know what is on the other side. And I think the study of this is fantastic. And one day there will be a formula to figure this all out. But this is really a great start. I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. This has been very enlightening, and for all our virtual guests too. Thank you for coming and enjoying a great talk. like we mentioned, we're going to have a YouTube for it, so you can visit it if you want to share it. Please visit greattalk.org. And we will have more in the future, so, stay in touch. I also do want to just mention for your parking vouchers that for the voucher, when you leave the garage, put your slip in. And then when it asks for the payment, then you can put your voucher in. So hopefully, want to thank Johns Hopkins and the Alexander Grass Humanities for hosting us. And our tech people, thank you. They stayed all night and they're wonderful and really worked it out for us. So have a wonderful night and have a good trip home. We had some long travelers, but thank you very much. Good night.